And I believe that. I actually am. I was born into a Catholic family. I'm very Christian in my beliefs. Johot happened when Hollywood's most controversial Christian filmmaker, Africa's youngest revolutionary, become one of the most watched interviews in television history. This is the story of how Traoré's words about Jesus Christ brought Mel Gibson to tears on live television. It was supposed to be a routine promotion interview. Mel Gibson, the Academy Award-winning director of The Passion of Christ, had agreed to appear on Global Perspectives, a primetime international affairs program, to discuss his upcoming projects and his continued exploration of faith-based cinema. The show's producers, however, had arranged something unexpected, a satellite connection to Burkina Faso, where Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the 4-year-old military leader who had taken power in 2 years prior, would join the contrast couldn't have been more striking. Gibson, the 68-year-old Australian-American actor and director, sat in a plush Los Angeles studio, his weather face bearing the marks of decades in Hollywood spotlight. Meanwhile, Traoré appeared on a modest office in Ouagadougou, wearing his characteristic military fatigues, his youthful face serious. But the interview began conventionally, with host Sarah Chin asking Gibson about his latest projects and his continued commitment to depicting religious themes in his work. Gibson spoke passionately about his Catholic faith and his belief that cinema could serve as a vehicle for faith has always been the driving force behind my most meaningful work, Gibson explained, his hands gesturing emphatically. When I made The Passion of Christ, I wasn't thinking about box office numbers. I was thinking about souls. Chin then turned to Traoré, introducing him as one of Africa's youngest heads of state and asking about his vision for Burkina Faso's future. Traoré spoke eloquently about sovereignty, about breaking free from neo-colonial influences, and about his determination to serve his people with integrity. Leadership is not about power, Traoré said, his voice steady and measured. It is about service. It is about sacrifice. These are principles I learned, not from political theory, but from my faith. It was Gibson who steered the conversation toward religion. Perhaps feeling a kinship with this young African leader, who also spoke of faith, Gibson leaned forward in his chair and asked a question that would change the entire tone of the interview. Captain Cher, I understand. You're a man of faith. A Simeon who has dedicated much of my career to exploring the story of Jesus Christ. I'm curious about your perspective. How do you see Christmas in the context of your leadership and your vision for Africa? The studio fell silent, except for the slight delay of the Traoré paused, his eyes seeming to look beyond the camera, as if gathering thoughts from a deep well of contemplation. Mr. Gibson, Traoré began, his voice taking on a different quality, softer, more reflective, yet carrying an undeniable authority. I have watched your film, The Passion of Christ. It is a powerful work, but I want to tell you something about Jesus that perhaps your Hollywood cannot capture. Something that in Africa understand, in our bones. Gibson straightened in his chair, clearly intrigued. The host, Sarah Chin, seemed to sense that something significant was about to unfold, and remained silent. You see, Traoré continued, in the West, you have often portrayed Jesus as this distant figure, this divine being who came to earth for a brief moment, suffered beautifully, and then ascended to heaven. You focus on his divinity, on his sacrifice, on his resurrection. These are all true and important. But there is something else. Something that speaks directly to those of us who have been oppressed, who have had our dignities stripped away. Traoré's voice grew stronger, more passionate, but not louder. It was a passion of conviction, not anger. Jesus was born under occupation, Roman occupation. His people were colonized just as my people were colonized. The Romans extracted wealth from Palestine just as the French extracted wealth from Burkina Faso. Jesus grew up watching foreign soldiers patrol his streets, just as I grew up with foreign military bases in my soil. Gibson's expression began to change. The confident filmmaker who had entered the interview was becoming something else. A listener, a student. But here is what your Western Christianity sometimes misses. Terry content. Jesus didn't just preach and forgiveness in abstract terms. He lived as a revolutionary. Not with weapons, not with violence, but with something far more dangerous to their powers. That be truth and complete spiritual freedom. Traoré leaned closer, to his camera, his intensity palpable, even through the satellite connection. When Jesus threw the merchants out of the temple, he wasn't just angry about religious corruption. He was confronting an entire economic system that poor in the name of God. When Hesed render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, he wasn't advocating for passive submission to authority. He was making a distinction between earthly power and divine authority, showing that earthly powers have limits. Gibson's eyes were now fixed completely on the screen. His usual animated gestures had stopped. He was listening with intensity. Cameras captured perfectly. Mr. Gibson, in your film, you showed Jesus' physical suffering beautifully, but let me tell you about his spiritual evolution. Jesus looked at the Pharisees, the religious establishment that collaborated with Rome, and called them vipers. He looked at the wealthy oppressed the poor, and said it would be easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for him to enter heaven. He didn't just defer our sins. He lived to show us that another way is possible. Traoré paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a weight that seemed to reach through the screen. This is the Jesus we know in Africa, Mr. Gibson. The Jesus who's the oppressed. The Jesus who looks at corrupt leaders and calls them out. The Jesus who doesn't just promise heaven after death, but demands justice here on earth. The Jesus who doesn't just forgive sins, but transforms suities. Said his voice, becoming more intimate. When I pray, I don't just think about Jesus dying on the cross. I think about Jesus, a young man, maybe my age, looking at this occupied homeland and deciding that would rather die than live as a slave to injustice. I think about Jesus seeing children go hungry, while the wealthy feast in choosing to speak truth even though he knew it would cost him everything. Gibson's breathing had become noticeably deeper. His hands, which had been clenched in his lap, were now pressed together as if in prayer. This is why I took the responsibility of leadership, Mr. Gibson, not because you wanted power, but because I saw my people suffering while foreigners grew it from our gold, our resources, I saw young people with no future, while the wealth of their ancestors was shipped to Paris banks. And I remember that Jesus didn't just pray for change, he embodied it. Troy's voice grew even softer, but somehow more powerful. Do you know what Jesus would say to me, Mr. Gibson, if he were here today? I believe he would say, Ibrahim, you have been given much. You have been given education. You have been given the trust of your people. You have been given this moment in history. What will you do with it? Will you use it to survey yourself? Or will you use it to lift up the least among your brothers and sisters? Gibson's composure was beginning to crack. His eyes were beginning to well up with tears. Anton Troy continued, I believe Jesus will tell me the same thing he told his disciples. The greatest among you will be a servant. Whoever wants to become a great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. Troy leaned back slightly, his voice taking on an almost prophetic quality. This is what leadership means in the light of Christ. Mr. Gibson, it means that every decision I make, I must ask, does this serve the poor? Does this serve the oppressed? Does this serve justice? Because if it doesn't, then I am not following Jesus. I am following Caesar. Gibson was now visibly emotional, tears beginning to stream down his face. Sarah Chen watched in amazement as one of Hollywood's most famously tough personalities was being moved to tears by the words of this young African leader. Mr. Gibson, Kaur said, seeming to sense the impact of his, I want you to know something. Your film, The Passion to Christ, it touched millions of hearts. It showed the world the depth of Jesus' love for humanity. But I want to challenge you, and I say this with great respect. To consider the Jesus who not only died for us, but who lived for us. The Jesus who showed us that love without justice is incomplete. That faith without action is dead. Gibson was now openly weeping. A professional composure completely gone. You have been given a great platform, Mr. Gibson. You have the ear of me. What if you use that platform not just to show Jesus' suffering, but to show Jesus' revolution? What if you help people understand that following Christ means standing with the oppressed, challenging the powerful, and building a world where every child has seen it to eat, and every person has dignity? Through his tears, Gibson managed to speak. His voice was thick with emotion, completely different from the confident tone he had maintained throughout his career. Captain Ibrahim Gibson said, using Tia's first name for first time, I thought I knew Christ. He thought I understood the gospel. But listening to you, God forgive me. I've been focused on the wrong things. Traoré's expression softened with, No, my brother. Traoré replied gently. You have not been focused on the wrong things. You have been focused on important things. The cross is central to our faith. But perhaps now is the time to also focus on a life that led to that cross. That made that Gibson wiped his eyes with his sleeve, completely unconcerned with his appearance on national television. "You're right," Gibson whispered. "Jesus wasn't just divine. He was revolutionary. He was Dengarusto, the established order because that people choose between serving God and serving power." "Exactly," Traoré nodded. "And that choice is still before us today. Every day we must choose, will we serve the God of justice and love, or will we serve the gods of wealth and power?" For another 20 minutes, but dynamic had completely shifted. Gibson, the seasoned interviewer subject, had become the student. Traoré, the young military leader, had become a teacher. They discussed practical theology, liberation theology, and the responsibility of Christians in positions of influence. When the interview finally ended, Gibson sat in stunned silence for several moments. Sarah Chen, the host, was clearly moved herself, and struggled to provide their standard closing remarks. "That was extraordinary." Chin finally managed to Captain Traoré, "Mr. Gibson, thank you both for what was certainly one of the most powerful conversations we've ever had on this program." In the weeks following the interview, the video went viral across platforms. The moment when Gibson broke down crying was viewed millions of times. But more importantly, the full interview sparked conversations in churches, universities, and living rooms around the world. Gibson himself later described the interview as life-changing. In subsequent interviews, he spoke about how Traoré's words had him to reconsider not just his faith, but his responsibility as an artist and public figure. "Ibrahim showed him a Jesus I thought I knew, but had somehow missed." Gibson said, "Weeks later, he showed me that Christmas isn't just about personality, it's about social transformation. It's about building the kingdom of heaven here on earth, not just waiting for it in the afterlife." For Traoré, the interview became a platform to share his vision of leadership rooted in faith and service. He continued to speak about the intersection of spirituality and social justice, drawing connections between Christ's teachings and the struggle for African independence and dignity. The interview remains a powerful example of how true dialogue can transform even the most established perspectives, and how the message of Jesus Christ continues to challenge and inspire people across all boundaries of culture, nationality. It was a reminder that sometimes the most profound theological insights come not from seminaries or Hollywood studios, but from the lived experience of those who, like Jesus himself, choose to stand with the oppressed and work for justice in a new. Hi.